I also thought I'd make a quick video mainly for the forum guys that bored us down, as I've had a few messages and a few sort of comments about Raspberry Pi setup with a lead called RGB-Pi and a custom version of RecalBox, and obviously this is it with the rather jazzy intro video that you've just seen. Now this stuff is running on one of my PVMs. It's on a PVM 20 M4E, which I think is it's an 800 line monitor. So for some of you it might be a little bit too sharp, but as you can see, or perhaps as you can't see, to the left of the TV is the Pi itself. It's a really simple setup, and it's just a case of copying the original image, or the image from the RecalBox image that the creator of the RGB-Pi has made in conjunction with the guys that have created RecalBox for this, and outputting at kind of 240p. So as you can see, we've got a pretty straightforward emulator screen here. Now none of these emulators, or cores I should say, will appear unless you've got the ROMs in the correct folders, which is really straightforward because it comes set up and you just have to sort of drag and drop them for those that might have not used this before, and there's a whole heap of stuff. So I've set this up at the moment just with my kind of favorite stuff, and there's probably 100-200 sort of games on here, and for me that's fine. There's obviously another solution, which is Groovy MAME, which we're going to look at well after this, really, just very quickly. And again, there's nothing overly technical in these videos, it's just to see how these things kind of run. So for example, if we pick something like you know, I don't know, Ghouls and Ghosts of Dave Makimura, as you can see. And again, this kind of, what they've actually thought about, the graphics are quite nice because they hide obviously all the kind of run commands and these kind of thing. For controls, that takes a load of different stuff. I'm currently using a Buffalo SNES style USB gamepad just because I had one lying around. As you can see, if you press select and B on here and go into settings, you'll actually see the resolution that it's running at. So it's a height of 224 like the arcade game, and then it uses 5 times the original width of the arcade to run in 1920. So for all intents and purposes, it's running just as the board would run. And then you've obviously got the refresh rate there, which is just you know, it's 60 hertz. Okay, so we'll take a look at that a bit more later on. Okay, again, really straightforward. It just runs as it should, and hopefully you can see, hopefully the camera is not going too much out of focus. It's not the greatest phone camera, and it does tend to sort of switch its focus sort of off and on. But as you can see, it runs perfectly. Over the weekend, as in last weekend, I went to a friend's house and we ran these. We ran a Pi in an arcade cabinet and then some original boards side by side. And neither of us could tell the difference, which of course is the purpose of it. So it runs everything as you'd expect. There's even some perhaps slightly more taxing stuff on there. So if we have a look at the FBA core here, I'll just blast through these, then I'll take you on kind of a short tour of them. If you look at the FBA core, now it's really important to use the LR-FBA core. That is the better one. But if we take a look at something like Street Fighter 3 Third Strike, boot into that, resyncs itself, and we'll see obviously that boots. Okay, so again, credits in, pick whoever you want to. And again, runs as just like the original CPS3 system. As you can see, you get a full screen image. And hopefully you can see this on the phone, but you've obviously got those lovely kind of scan lines. Again, this image may be too sharp for some people. It's slightly sharper than an arcade monitor would be. But all running at lovely kind of low res. And then it's just a key combination again to boot back into this menu here. Now the games we've just seen obviously run at virtually the same resolution. I think one would be 224, one would be 240 height wise. Something like R-Type, which you'll see very shortly when it kicks in. Okay, boot sequence. Yeah, we are committing a violation. So you will obviously see, for those of you that know the game well, the bottom of the screen looks as though it's cut off, and if we underscan it, which is the nice thing about having, you know, a PVM or a BVM, you can underscan, we get virtually the whole image. Okay, but it looks a bit weird because it pillar boxes. The pillar box is obviously at the side. So, and that's because if we unsync it, that's because if you take a look at the video settings, now the native height for this is 256, okay, and it's running at 55 hertz, okay, more or less. So actually what it's reading it as is a 60 hertz signal running at 256. So you have to set your monitor up. So this is the sort of downside of any, obviously, of this kind of retro stuff. As I'm sure we all know, when arcade machines came out or when boards came out, they would adjust the pots in the monitor, occasionally, you know, obviously sometimes not. We've all played on knackered old machines and games that don't fit the screen properly. But they would adjust them to suit that game because they were there for one game. Because we're running multiple games that run at different resolutions, different refresh rates, different heights and widths, we have to adjust accordingly. So my monitor is set up for kind of CPS1 stuff, Neo Geo stuff, and then occasionally you'll get games like R-Type, WrestleFest is another one that will actually, because they run at 60 hertz, they will be cut off top and bottom 8 pixels, or occasionally a few more will get cut off. But you know, that's no bad thing. You can underscan it, or you've just got to sort of live with it and adjust it like that. Now, midway is an interesting one because as you'll see, if we run NBA Jam, all of their games ran the lower end of the 50 hertz range. So they ran somewhere between sort of 53, 54 and occasionally 55. They also have they also have an odd height of 254. So it's not a standard 224 or 240. So it's odd. So it should technically be too tall for the screen that I've got set up. Now, what's the great thing, or what is a great thing, I should say, with a PVM or a BVM is actually you can set the screen based on 50 hertz timings or 60 hertz timings. So my 50 hertz timing is actually set up via hardware, via the PVM, to accommodate, as you can probably see, for this image. So when we look at the image here, you can see that largely the full screen is in view, even though it is technically a taller image than something like Street Fighter 3, which we just ran. So if we pick, I don't know, probably Golden State, they've got Tim Hardaway. Why can't I see Golden State? Oh, right there. Okay, so him and Mullen. Okay, and we take a little look as it boots in. Okay, you can see, obviously, let's just run through this. Everything is being displayed pretty much, it might miss a couple of pixels, as it should be. And when someone scores, eventually, okay, I won't block him, you'll see obviously everything is kind of as it should be, and there's no cut off than the bottom or the top of the screen. And that is purely because of the settings that the PVM allows for. Because it allows you to set up an image to 60 hertz, and most arcade boards run at 60 hertz, but it obviously reads the midway stuff at a 50 hertz refresh rate. Okay, even though it's sort of 53 to 54, which is really, really good. So, and that's again, so the combination of the Pi and this monitor, you're actually most of the time, well, when it comes to midway games and sort of, you know, Play System 1 or 2 games or Neo Geo games, you are generally getting a sort of, say, a better image, but you're getting or you've got a piece of hardware that allows for that change and will actually suit your screen better. So you don't need to reach in and alter any sort of pots internally or anything like that, as you would have to do on an arcade machine. Okay, so just a quick kind of rundown then. You've got MAME on here. There's Neo Geo again. All these run perfectly. Everything. Even something like Ironclad as well, which you've kind of got on here too. PlayStation, again, everything on here runs perfectly. So Gunner's Heaven, which is a great kind of run and gun shooter, which was obviously not an arcade game, now runs beautifully at kind of 240p on here. Ridge Racer, and of course, because the Pi is underpowered, you can't run, you know, the System 22 games or anything like that. And you've got, so I can run Tekken and Tekken 2 on here perfectly. There's no issue whatsoever, and Thunder Force 5 as well. And you can add and of course change what you want there. N64, I don't tend to run that. It doesn't run that well. I'm not that interested because you know, I'm not. Snares, all these run perfectly as well. You know, even obviously the Super FX stuff. Nintendo runs perfectly. Game Boy Advance, Mega Drive, you've got the Mega CD, which is great, or the Sega CD as it's called in the States, and obviously you've got something like Final Fight CD. Now, the nice thing here, what the guys actually have put on with RecalBox, is it allows you to choose on boot what kind of, oh, that's me setting that up wrong, allows you to choose on boot what refresh rate it runs at. So with the console stuff, if we run Vampire Killer, for example, so 50 or 60 hertz. Now obviously you're not going to choose, you know, 50, but you can if you want, and again the screen is adjusted to that. But if you look at something like Vampire Killer, now I own this for many years and stupidly sold it, but you know, it runs just as my version did. I played this a lot. I finished it 2 or 3 times, so I know the game really well, and it runs and looks to my eye certainly that, you know, pretty much, well, it looks perfect. There's no frame drops, no sound drops, and I'm sure you can see this is all running at 240p. Okay, and there's no screen tearing whatsoever. Okay, and if we look at cool charge. If we look at the settings again here. At the video, it's running at obviously the correct refresh rate of a Mega Drive or a Genesis that they would be. Okay, and same thing across all consoles. So for SNES, for Mega CD, you got 32X, Master System, you know, the SG-1000 in Japan, Game Gear, etc., etc. All the Super Graphics stuff will, you know, will run on this perfectly as well. There's only really a couple of things I've had an issue with. Which is via MAME actually. Things like Demon Front I've struggled with, the PCB and the and the cart with the PGM, the Polygame Master BIOS, I can't get to work at all. I think Wild West Cowboys of Moo Mesa, I struggled to get working, and every now and then again a ROM will work and then suddenly won't, and then will again. Not really sure why that is, but generally everything runs perfectly. There's also a really nice option in there, I'm not going to go into it, in the screen utility to rotate the screen, and it's literally kind of a sort of, you know, one button press. You can rotate the screen, you can rotate the monitor, and all the vertical games, you know, Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, etc., etc., all the shooters will run vertically in the correct resolution and refresh rate as well. So all the Neo stuff runs perfectly. Metal Slug 5, everything will run on there. Even things like Salamander 2, which I thought, you know, might push the system a bit, still run it. You can overclock this to 1.4 gigahertz. If you do that, some of the F3 stuff, like Elevator Action Returns, which is a great game, will run, but you have to use advanced MAME rather than this core, just because it gets a little bit of a speed boost on that. But if you take a look at something like Ninja Turtles, which will run right now on this, and then very shortly I'll switch over to a Groovy MAME setup, and you can see the difference, or indeed lack of, between this and Groovy MAME running on a PC. So there we go. We'll just boot that in. Just hit Leonardo. Okay, and just hopefully you can see all runs at 240p. This is pillar box. It always was in the arcade at the start, and then it runs sort of as expected, really, on here. You know, and while I get beat up by the Foot Clan, there we go. You know, this is I've got a slightly different ROM on Groovy MAME. It's the 4-player version. I think the enemies' attack patterns are slightly different as well. But we'll do a quick comparison between that. Here we are in Groovy MAME. This is just a quick comparison, really, so you can see the difference, or the lack of difference, between the Groovy MAME setup, which is running on a small form factor PC. As you can probably hear, it's silent for all intents and purposes, but it's running about 3 gigahertz. Now, comparing something like Ninja Turtles, booting into that, you can see the horizontal res is higher. That's obviously it's lower on the Pi. That's due to the limited pixel clock. But the results are pretty much, you know, to my eye at least, virtually the same. So the monitor is obviously set up. This PVM is set up for the Pi, so it's not set up for this. So if you see some sort of black borders one side or another, like there for example on the left, that's just because it's I've not aligned the monitor for the PC, it's aligned for the Pi. And as you can see, looks pretty much identical here. Okay, cool. So advantages of Groovy MAME really, well for me there's not that many. I can get certain games running on here obviously that I couldn't on the Pi. Sometimes that's not due to the faster CPU either. Sometimes for some reason they just don't seem to work on the Pi. And I've got all the correct ROM sets, but there's probably only a handful really that I want to play that don't work, and I literally do mean sort of 4 or 5. There's Demon Front, which is excellent on the Poly Game Master. So that will run straight away, as you can see on here on Groovy MAME. Where we're on the Pi, although some people have said they've got this working on RetroPie, I've yet to get this working on RecalBox. Even the PCB version, which should work because no BIOS is needed, doesn't seem to work. But this is a great game, and as you can see, this runs perfectly on the Groovy MAME. When I press the right buttons, that is. Okay, so yeah, there we go. So, and this is Ace, and again I played through the actual game cart because for those that don't know the PGM system, these came on a sort of motherboard in the cart base, like the F3 system or like an MVS. And I managed to play through on the original board and cart this weekend in a mini sort of Dino King cabinet, which is great. And there's no difference I can see between this and the actual cartridge. So yeah. And again, you've got there's obviously other things you can play as well, perhaps some more advanced stuff. Death Smiles, I'm not sure if that works on the Pi, I haven't actually tried it, but some of the later cave shooters work on here as well. What I also like on Groovy MAME, which doesn't seem quite as good on the Pi, is the vert games. So you don't have to rotate it here. It seems to display correctly. If you, as you can probably see here, it looks like it's running in its original kind of 240 progressive state. On a sort of custom version of Pi software for Pi3b, you can run vertical games like this on a horizontal screen, but it will interlace the image. And here, at least to my eye, the image is not interlaced at all, as far as I can see. So it actually still runs in the correct resolution, as you can see, without having to turn the monitor on its side. Obviously, the F3 games run a lot better on here than they would do on the Pi. On the Pi, if you overclock it to about 1.4 and run the ROMs through Advanced MAME rather than MAME 2003 or anything like that, you will tend to get full speed. On Groovy MAME, obviously on this PC, as we can see here, it will run obviously straight away and perfectly. Now, as you can see, because of the resolution, it will still cut off just a few pixels top and bottom, but you have to go for what I find is kind of a best fit, because not all games obviously have the same height resolution, which is what causes some of the issues later. But as you can see, this runs, there's me dying, this runs perfectly. There's no screen tearing, no frame skipping by the looks of things, and etc, etc. So the F3 games run really well, which is nice. One thing, or one advantage that I've noticed the Pi has, or more specifically the version of RecalBox that we're using here, so when you run a midway game, something like, okay, let's go with Mortal Kombat 2, because the refresh rate is about 54 hertz, as you can see there, you get screen rolls. Now this can be fixed on the monitor by just fiddling with the vertical hold, but as we've seen on the Pi, that doesn't happen at all, which is really, really interesting. And it's sort of stopped now, but it's sort of inching its way up, as you can see. That's because of the hertz rate that the midway games operate on. If you go down to, so that was 54. If you look at something like NBA Jam, that is, oh, I'm not sure what that is, but I think that's 53. So they operate in this range of the sort of lower end of 50 hertz, so that's 54 as well. But some of them run slightly differently, and as a result, they don't always sync to the monitor. Now, if you're running this in an arcade monitor, you're going to have to, depending on what you're running, crawl underneath the bezel or something like that to get, depending on what you've got, to alter the pots, to alter the vertical hold on that to stop it from being a pain. So that's definitely an advantage that the Pi has. I think overall, I prefer the Pi purely for simplicity. It's set up. It's got a really nice intro video. Yeah, I know this obviously isn't set up, but it's just really kind of straightforward to plug and play, which is what it's made for. So that about wraps it up. I think for my money, and just for ease of use, Pi is great, and there's a brilliant version of sort of almost hacked together Pi3Jammer that over on the UKVac forums Vic has put together, and people like Dave Flynn have kind of expanded on that idea as well. So if you're building a jammer cabinet or sort of all-in-one cab and you want everything to run at the original resolutions, that's a really nice solution, because obviously it's a really tiny little thing to run in your system. And sometimes these kind of Optiplex systems or these small form factor PCs have a tendency to fail fairly frequently. So yeah, that's about it. Hopefully that has been useful to some of you, just as a quick kind of reference video. Again, nothing really in depth, but just so you get the idea of the Pi and perhaps the Groovy MAME setup, and you can see some of the differences and similarities obviously between them. Cheers.